So we have three speakers. I'm in Cambridge and I'm just chairing. We have two speakers in Tokyo, Sayuri Daimon and Jun Mukoyama. And we have Professor Lynda Gratton speaking from London. I'll just very briefly introduce the three of them in the order they're going to appear. So next slide. So first of all, we're going to be hearing from Jun Mukoyama. She is a fellow at Asia Pacific Initiative, which is a think tank based in Tokyo. She has experience working at Mitsubishi Corporation and also in Toronto for a Canadian pension fund. And she has a master's from Harvard. Then moving on, second speaker will be Sayuri Daimon. She is Executive Operating Officer and Senior Editorial Writer at the Japan Times, which is Japan's main English language newspaper. And she was the first female managing editor in the paper's long history, and she was the chief editor for 6 years. She also was at Harvard University. She won a Japan Women Award from Forbes Japan in 2016 and has published a couple of books. And then the third speaker will be Professor Lynda Gratton. She's Professor of Management Practice at London Business School, which is just around the corner from us, except that, of course, we're not there and neither is she right at the moment. And she's an expert on HR strategy in transforming companies and the future of work. And I gather she's in extremely hot demand at the moment because we're sort of doing the future of work right now. So she's in Zoom meetings all day long. And she has written quite a few books about how work is going to change in the future and how we need to adapt to it.
Thank you, Jason, for the kind introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. So, good afternoon. My name is Jun Mukoyama, and I am sure that Miss Daimon and Professor Gratton will speak and share good insights. So I'll just, my role here will be to warm up this webinar by sharing the recent survey I conducted. So I'd like to share that I recently conducted a survey in Tokyo to share toward the parents with preschool children. This is because the lockdown has posed very much challenges to the parents with small children. And the result made clear that many children and parents were suffering during the lockdown, particularly due to closure of the childcare facilities. This survey was widely covered by the media, and it started a discussion in Japan. So starting with the background, in Japan, government declared state of emergency on April 7th, and Japan didn't have actually strict lockdown compared to other countries, but almost all the childcare facilities were closed, with exception for the children, for the healthcare workers. And at the same time, many workers started to shift to the remote work. And why did I start this survey? This is because of my personal experience. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and remote work with her present was almost impossible. She behaved well for the first few days, but after that, she cried and cried that she didn't want me to work, and she interrupted my video conference call, and it seemed just not sustainable. And so I wondered how others are surviving in this environment. But it seems that not much attention about how parents were handling this work and childcare responsibilities at home. And I saw two reasons. One is that in Japan, since the Abe administration in 2012 started, the number of women in labor force increased for 10% to 70%. And yet Japan is has a seniority system, so very few women is at the decision-making body. So government and company policies are still based on model family, which is the word used in government documents, which means full-time husband and stay-at-home moms, and moms raising children. But and also Japanese culture encouraged not to bring private matter into workplace. So the parents were hesitant to speak out about their challenges to their boss or to their colleagues. So this issue was seemingly huge, but it never came up in the Japanese media. So we decided to conduct a survey, and the first step was to raise awareness about the issue itself. So the survey results and show that how parents were taking care of their children during remote work. And more than 60% of the respondents had childcare obligations at home while taking a break from work, which means they had to do their work and take care of children at the same time while taking break from both. And only 30% of parents took paid or unpaid leave, or they were on temporary absence from work to take care of children. And use of babysitters during the lockdown was not very widespread at 4%. And this is the heartbreaking part, that because of this balancing of the responsibilities, about half of the parents answered that their child's physical condition, health, and well-being have been affected. Many respondents made comments about their children became emotionally unstable, like screaming or nighttime crying, gained weight, not having enough exercise. And also the biggest concern for the parents were about the long screen time, where parents have to take the video conference call and children are just on YouTube for the whole time. And the work performance, about half of the respondents answered that they could only achieve 50% or less compared to pre-lockdown due to their childcare responsibilities. So during the day, most of the parents were interrupted by childcare responsibilities, and many parents had to work during night or early in the morning to compensate for that time. And as a result, many of the parents felt physically and mentally exhausted. And also they felt that they are at risk of underappreciated by their workplace, or even many of them felt that they might lose their jobs. So what made so difficult during lockdown is there are three particular conditions because of the COVID-19 situation. One is limited access to other care options. Many families usually rely on their grandparents to take care of their children, but for this crisis, they couldn't travel to their grandparents' houses. And also elderly are more at risk for this disease. And they were stuck in a very small apartment. If you have ever been in Japan, many of families in Japan are spending their time in a small apartment, and there's not enough space to concentrate on work. And of course, there's no space for children to play, and parks were banned, and equipments were taped not for use during this time. And also, lastly, parents had a difficult time at work because of the crisis, and many had a risk of losing jobs, and many had to use up their holidays, and some had to extend their maternity leave because of the childcare facilities are not available. slide. So having these results from the survey, we as a parent group made recommendations to the government and other stakeholders. And the first step was to let everyone know that it is a big challenge for the majority of parents to have balance taking care of preschool children and working from home. And since the state of emergency had been lifted, preschool and nursery homes and childcare facilities are back in operation. So is this problem all gone is the question, but we're still expecting second wave. We might have to deal with second wave, and the working style has completely changed since the COVID crisis. So in case the second wave comes, we recommended the policymakers to consider evidence carefully when deciding on school closures. Japanese Pediatrics Association clearly said that the risk of getting COVID-19, comparing risk of COVID-19 risk and risk of children being adversely affected by not being in school, their doctors recommended that you have to be really careful about deciding school closures. So first thing is the closing of schools and preschools really necessary. And the second thing is for the employers. Employers need to understand that carrying responsibility may be employees with carrying responsibility may be working in a challenging environment. So they need to be cared, considering their based on their environment. And also for the parents, they need to consider alternative options for the childcare in case there may be another wave of COVID-19 and the group care may not be available again. So, but this situation is not only the negative sides. There has been a few positive sides to this situation. And one is that many fathers spend more time at home sharing household work. And although the many studies show that women are likely to be taking more responsibilities in the developed countries, Japan's fathers have the least time spent at household work. So this is a good sign that they had a chance to join, had that chance to spend more time at home. And also, many Japanese experience remote work for the first time. In our survey mentioned that about half of the employees experienced remote work for the first time due to this occasion. And it will pave the way for the parents with child care responsibility to build flexible work style even after the pandemic ends. So I think that is a good sign. I think we had a few takeaways conducting this survey, and I think the biggest one being imagination is the key. There are a lot of articles about remote work being efficient and productive, but the environment that employees are in may be different based on their carrying responsibilities or other situations. So I think diversity in the leadership and having good imagination about their employees' environment is a good lesson that we had from the survey. Thank you very much. I'll hand it back to Jason. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Mukoyama. That's some really interesting data in there. And I suppose Japan, more than most places, the government or the authorities consist mainly of older men. Anyway, let's move on to our second speaker then, Sayuri Daimon. Over to you, Daimon-san.
Okay, let me share my slides first. Just a moment. Okay, hello everyone. Can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Yes, that's fine. Yeah.
And also you can hear me as well.
Yes, great.
Okay.
Carry on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I am the former managing editor and the senior editorial writer right now. As Mukoyama-san talked about the situation of working mothers, I would like to talk about how Japan's working environment has changed because of the remote work and COVID-19. Before going into that, I want to introduce a study by Professor Elliot Sherman of London Business School briefly. This was done by, well, actually, this was done before COVID-19 hit the world, but it shows an important point relevant to today's discussion, I think. According to this, the Professor Sherman says that the mothers remain disproportionately responsible for childcare. So he compares with, this compares with childless women and also men. And participants in this experiment chose to take an average of 2 remote work days per week. And the study found that the quality and quantity of work significantly improved for everyone, but especially for working mothers. And the main reason is that the mothers can reduce time and frequency disturbed by domestic duties and care work by telework. So basically, this is not directly applying to the COVID-19 situation, but in general, remote working can increase job performance, but the effect was greater for mothers. So I thought it was quite interesting findings. So let me talk about Japan Times. In the case of Japan Times, we have lots of working mothers and also fathers. And based on that study assumption, I actually wrote an editorial titled "Use the Coronavirus Crisis to Promote Teleworking" back in March. Actually, because I wrote this because I was hoping that employees will be able to spend much more time with their families, and most importantly, fathers will be able to spend more time participating in childcare. So actually, this photo you're seeing is my colleague Jim, who recently had the second child. He actually asked us to work remotely back in October and last year, and that was like months before the COVID-19 situation. But he said that he wanted to work for 2 months while his wife was in the final stage of pregnancy, and also he wanted to take care of his first daughter. I mean the first child, and so he can use his commuting time for those those care work. So after he worked for 2 months, and he actually decided to work remote 3 days a week and 2 days in the office. So he said that he could use extra hours to spend for picking up his daughter and also taking care of his wife and baby. So he said it was kind of interesting that he said, I could be at the office instantly, and when I was done with work, I'd be home instantly. So it's like, like Star Trek. So this experience actually prepared him and also as us, like as his co-workers, for the latest pandemic. And after the COVID-19 outbreak, the Japan Times also issued a company-wide order to work from home on February 18th. This actually coincided with shifting to a new editorial system, so that created quite a chaotic situation. But thanks to the past experience, actually we had, as you know, the Japan experienced quite a big typhoon last fall. And also, we have, even today, we had a big earthquake in Chiba. So every time we have a big natural disasters, sometimes trains operations get suspended. So we usually try to work remotely, try to log into our system and edit and also put together a newspaper. So that actually worked well. And as I talked to many other media organization people like around the world, they're actually moving to remote work quite quickly. As for Japanese organization, I think I kind of think that they were quite slow. And they only started, for example, like TV stations, they only started accepting kind of remote work like at the end of March. And I also want to talk about our domestic news division manager, Kanako Takahara. Unlike many Japanese media organizations, we have lots of female editors and managers. And Kanako has managed super busy domestic news division while taking care of her 3 kids. She actually wrote a story about her experience teleworking or teleconference editing and all that. So this is the story, and she said that like when she started the video conference, maybe her 8-year-old and 6-year-old peek over my shoulder giggling, and also but 10 minutes later the children get bored and start fighting. So her colleagues started saying that, could you turn off your microphone so that we can hear the other speaker's voice more clearly? So this is probably familiar to many of the audience today, like who's the working mothers. I think this is a kind of a worldwide phenomenon. But she said because of the article, many colleagues came to understand her situation. So I think that it's always good or like better to let people know your situation. And that was a big, that could be a big plus. Now, okay, so as Mukoyama-san described, but I just also wanted to mention about why so much burden on working mothers. People might think that, Japanese women, actually the proportion of Japanese women working is not as high as Western countries. But according to our studies, about 72.7% of women between ages of 25 and 44 in Japan has a job. This compares with 80% in Sweden. So this age bracket is the child rearing age. The women bear a child, and also they are engaged in care work for their children. And on top of actually on top of other areas, like we have certain Japan factors, I think. Some of them mentioned by Mukoyama-san, but I also want to mention some of other things as well. So the daycare centers only accepted children of those who are engaged in medical services at the time during the lockdown in Japan when the emergency state of emergency was announced. This was the case, so that many children were not accepted. So the mothers had to take care of the children. And also children have been told not to go outside during the school hours, roughly from 8 to 3 p.m. So, and then also they're not supposed to play at the park or visit friends or go to the library. So this put the tremendous pressure on the children as well as their parents. Also the limited working space within the house. And also another thing that I wanted to mention is that there was no support system where parents can rely on if they were infected with COVID-19 at the very beginning, so that if the parents are infected, and then if they had like 2 children, they didn't know what to do. They can't leave their children. So it was really a tough situation for working parents. So this factor put tremendous pressure on working parents and especially mothers, I think. So simply it is not possible to handle both work and childcare, I think, by themselves. And so what has changed? I mean, what changes did the pandemic bring to Japan? Now, the most recent survey by Tokyo Chamber of Commerce and Industry actually was conducted in early this month, or late last month through this month. And it shows 67.3% of Tokyo-based companies have introduced telework. This is up 41.3% since March. So it's a big, big jump. So now more and more companies are adapting the telework. But there is still a big gap between large and small-sized companies. And while 90% of large companies introduced the telework, only 45% of small firms allow their employees to work from home. And also there's another survey by Cabinet Office, which was announced on June 1st, which I thought it was quite interesting. The 70% of the respondents said that they spend more time with their families now. And 81.99% of them said they want to keep it that way from now on. And also 34.1% said that they became more aware of their partner's role and became more cooperative. So which is really good for Japan, especially. And also about Tokyo, the concentration of Tokyo, it's we have a very big, Tokyo is a very big city and everything is concentrated. But 15% of the respondents said that they have become more interested in living outside Japan. So this is overall figure, but when you look at the breakdowns, and people in the 20s who live in Tokyo's 23 wards seems to be more interested. And there are actually 35.4% of those in the 20s showed interest in moving to rural areas, which is, I think, is interesting. The younger kids are more interested in moving out. And I think that we need to prepare for the second wave, and by experiencing the first pandemic, we actually have some takeaways, and I think this is kind of a must proposal, I think, which is the first is financial support is important, but most importantly, there needs to be a measure not to isolate those with child-rearing responsibilities. And second, providing online study program across the board. So this was also another problem because school was closed abruptly, and most of the schools were not prepared, and also municipalities were not prepared. So, and some of the municipalities decided not to offer online classes because of the fairness, they said. Some of the kids are not equipped with personal computers, and it's not going to be fair for, those people who cannot get access to online classes. But I think now that we've experienced all this, and I think we should really think about offering online services, or like there was actually a big gap between private schools and the public schools, because private schools went ahead and started offering classes online. So we really have to think about it and don't leave it to each household. And the third point is a support system. I mentioned about the parents who got infected with COVID-19. So we need to have some kind of support system. And finally, the companies. Some company may try to move back to the pre-pandemic era. So I think they should keep allowing flexible work styles. And I wanted to actually mention some of the examples of the businesses, like the work style reform efforts by some businesses. For example, like Toshiba, they have announced that they are making allowing workers at plants to work 4 days a week. And also the company made working hours of those working days longer to make up for the total working hours per week. Also, Lion will hire employees of other companies as contract workers, and looking so that they are actually looking for talented individuals who are skilled in starting new businesses. So it's actually flexibility is coming into the business sector as well. And finally, I'd like to talk about telework. Can actually solve Japan's long-term issues. Maybe not many people might not be aware of it, but like there's there's so many issues, long-term issues, like Japan lacks work and life balance, aging society, and all these things in the chart. But actually it helps probably digitalize transformation of society. Working from home enables mothers and fathers to spend more time with their kids. And people don't have to quit their jobs to take care of their aging parents if they can work remotely. And companies can hire young, talented people in regional communities as well. And that would probably revitalize rural communities. And that would also reduce congestion in urban areas and help cut carbon dioxide emissions. Companies can also better cope with natural disasters and risk management if we can adapt the remote work. So what we learned from the first wave of the pandemic, I'm sure we can do better. With that, I'm optimistic, so I'm just gonna end with optimistic notes, but I'd like to end my presentation. I hope some of the examples can help you. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Daimon-san. So let's move to London and hear from Professor Lynda Gratton.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you very much for inviting me. I'm not going to use slides actually, because I wanted very much to respond to what was coming out of the panel. I'm going to talk about 3 things in the next 15 minutes. Number 1, where were we before the pandemic? Number 2, what's happening during the pandemic? And number 3, what's the way forward in terms of what we're rather optimistically calling the new norm? Let's take a look first at what happened before the pandemic. Well, interestingly enough, there has been very little research on home working. In fact, the only research on home working was done by Professor Bloom at Stanford, which looked at Chinese call center workers. And what he found was 2 really interesting things about home working. The first was that in terms of home working, so he did an experimental group, half stayed at home, half stayed in the office. He had pre and post performance measures. And what he found is that home workers in general were 13% more productive. However, and this is the big however, they were at home with an office of their own and decent technology, and B, they weren't disturbed by children. So that's already the first thing. So actually home working can be more productive. but you cannot be disturbed by children. The second thing he found is that after the 6-month period, of the people who were working in their home, 50% wanted to come back to the office, even though they had in China long commutes, because they were missing the social activity of others. They missed others. And by the way, we found that we've been surveying people from the beginning of COVID. I've been keeping a diary, a COVID diary. I'm now on day 101. And so we've been surveying people from the very beginning. And actually people said, you know, the technology is fine. I like spending time with my kids. But the overwhelming thing they said is, I miss my colleagues. Now, we may be surprised about that, but basically they said they miss their colleagues. So, you know, this is an interesting pre-pandemic story. We knew very little about home working, by the way. There were very little decent studies of what it was to work from home. But at the same time, we sort of knew that this was going to be a good thing. For those of you who are fans of my book, you'll know there's a new book coming out, but sadly not until spring for you guys, The New Long Life. And Andrew and I, you know, my colleague who's an economist, looked again at, you know, how could we live when you live a long life? When we wrote the 100-Year Life, of course, Japan had the longest living population. I'm afraid Hong Kong has now pipped you to that. And that's part of the reason I've been involved in Prime Minister Abe's council for the last couple of years, because, you know, he's very interested in that, and of course interested in childcare and so on and so forth. So that's where we were before the pandemic. Let's just take a quick look at what happened during the pandemic. And I'm going to make 3 points about that, which come out of our own work. I've been doing an enormous amount of webinars. I've done quite a lot of press in Japan. So if you drop me a note, either through LinkedIn or come direct to my email, lgratton@london.edu. In fact, I'll put it on the chat. You'll find, I'll send you a whole bunch of stuff about what we've been doing. But these are the 3 things that I think are most interesting in terms of the conversation we've just had. Number 1, we asked people whether what had happened to their productivity during working from home and lockdown. 54% said their productivity had gone up, and 43% said their productivity had gone down. What was the variable that was most important to whether they felt their productivity had gone up or gone down? You can guess. Whether they had children at home. So one thing to remember in terms of home working is that there's enormous diversity of experience depending on whether you're looking after young kids. I actually, some of you know that I have 8 children. I wasn't the mother to all of them, by the way, but actually I've only got one of them living with me now in London, and he's 30 years old, and he's here because he was working in New York and had to come home. But I don't have any young kids at home. So actually my productivity has gone up. But friends of mine, in fact, my own children who have children of their own, I can see exactly the challenges they face. Number 1. Number 2, our data exactly chimes with the Japanese data, which is that if you look at who does the domestic work in the home, and we again ask them, how many hours a week are you spending working, looking after the kids, you know, looking after the home and so on, there was a clear, significant difference between men and women. And so sadly, that is not a Japanese phenomena. It's happening everywhere. That's very disappointing, I have to say. There's been some aspects of the future world have accelerated, but that's not one of them. So, you know, corporations might keep asking women to lean in. I'm saying to men, please step up to your responsibilities. And I think that's an issue, because what we know is that people who work from home are less likely to be promoted. We saw that actually out of the Chinese study. And my worry is that actually some of the, you know, the amazing developments that have happened with women around the world, less so in Japan, of course, are being pulled back because women are working from home. They're doing more work than men, more domestic work than men. And that means, you know, they're A, less likely to be promoted because they can't be seen, and B, they're actually just working more hours in terms of looking after kids. So that's where we are in terms of COVID right now. One thing that we talked about a lot during this lockdown, as I've been running webinars, I've run webinars, a number of webinars on home working. And the point that I make is that, you know, the reason quite a lot of us like to work from an office is because it helps us manage our boundaries. You know, we get up in the morning, we put our suit on, we walk to the office, we have a cup of coffee. Here's my cappuccino, my espresso of third of the day. It's been a long day. We have our coffee, and in that process, all of those rituals we go through help us to change our mindset. So under normal circumstances, when we're working from the office, we have two transitions. We go from home to work, from work to home. And of course, in Japan, you have even more transitions if you stay out and, you know, drink in evenings, which I know most of the working mums don't do, but lots of the working dads do. So these are all transitional routines. When you're working at home with kids, and even without children, you're interrupted all the time, maybe 15 times a day. And each time you're interrupted, your mind has to switch from dealing cognitively with your work and then dealing cognitively with your kids. And that's very, very stressful. And by the way, day 100 in the UK, and I know a lot longer in Tokyo, people are becoming exhausted. Everybody, no, not just people with kids at home, everyone is exhausted. So I don't think the way we're working is going to be, you know, work for the future. So in the last 5 minutes, I want to talk a bit about the way forward and how might we hold on to some of this acceleration of the future of work, but also, you know, end up in a place that we all feel better about. And let me make a number of suggestions. Number one, we've all become technical, digital natives, haven't we? And that's been an extraordinary thing. People have said, you know, older people don't understand technology. Well, here I am, 65, and I am going from one, you know, Zoom meeting to another, to this, to that. We're all technologically literate, and that's a very important point, that for most of us, our technology is held up. I don't think if we'd had this pandemic 5 years ago, we would have had this sort of platforms of it. In fact, I know we couldn't. So that's number one. Let's keep on using the technology. Number two, we like home working, but we don't want to do it all the time. Now, you're going to notice that companies are going to be pretty keen on home working because it reduces costs. And remember that we are moving into a major recession, and those of us in developed countries are going to feel that very much. And the easiest thing to do is to reduce costs with office. So, but I don't think home working will reduce costs, because companies should be supporting you to work from home. So you need proper technology, a proper chair. I have here a marvelous chair that was actually sent all the way from Japan. So this, I'm sitting on an extraordinary Japanese chair that was sent by one of my clients to me, and I can't tell you how much I'm loving it. So you need all of this. So companies have to do that. Secondly, you have to ask yourself, what's an office for? Why do we bother having an office? Why do we go to the office? Well, we go to the office to socialize, to see friends, to drink coffee, to innovate. And so offices should be places of innovation. And I come out to Tokyo quite a lot, as many of you know. And I still think that the offices look pretty boring in terms of innovation. So we need to make our offices more innovative. And my third suggestion, well, I've got four actually, this is number three. Number three, we're working longer hours. And we can't carry on doing that forever. And you know, the survey we heard about just earlier showed that parents are now working in the evenings. This is not a long-term proposition. So we have to also build in time flexibility, not just flexibility about where you work, but also flexibility about when you work. And finally, and I really want to reinforce the points that my two wonderful fellow panelists have already made, which is to say that we have to move measurement of performance from outcome to presenteeism. And that's a real problem in Japan. I have a Future Work Consortium, some of you are a member of that, which has hubs in London, Tokyo, and Sydney. And, you know, Japan has very specific working practices with regard to presenteeism, which is extremely difficult for women. I've been saying for 20 years that Japan has to stop looking at presenteeism as a measure of performance and moving to outcomes. This is your moment to do that. If you let this crisis go without doing that, that's a huge, I think, a huge lost opportunity. So I'm going to say to all of you on the webinar today, if you want your company to change, you've got to make it now to say, we want to work at home more, but we want proper technology and we want nice office, you know, nice desks and good chairs, and you have to pay for that. Number two, we want you to look at flexibility of time so that when we work at home, we have time to also do our domestic. Number three, we want to encourage men to look after their kids. How do you do that? The most important thing you do is you give them paternity leave so they fall in love with their children when they're babies. Now, I'm not suggesting dads don't love their kids, I know they do. But actually, to really feel that emotional connection, you need to spend time with them when they're babies. So let's make sure that all Japanese companies really focus on paternity leave as well. Thanks very much.
Well, I'm going to wrap it up now. Thank you so much to all three of you for leading us through and teaching us a lot about what's going on, both in Japan and elsewhere in the world. And that's all.